Imagine waking up in a world where the Nazis won World War II. No, this isn't some dystopian nightmare you can shake off with a strong coffee, it's the terrifying, what if, we're diving into today. Welcome to What If Horizons, the podcast that explores the darkest, weirdest, and most absurd alternate realities history could have thrown at us. Buckle up, because this ride is going to be bumpy, bizarre, and occasionally so ridiculous you'll laugh just to keep from screaming. So, Hitler's Germany comes out on top. The swastika isn't just a symbol of infamy, it's on flags, textbooks, maybe even your morning cereal box. The first thing you'd notice: the time zone. Because if the Nazis had their way, we'd all be running on Berlin Standard Time, whether we liked it or not. Forget daylight savings, how about Führer savings? But let's get serious for a second, just a second, don't worry. A Nazi victory wouldn't just mean bad fashion choices, those leather coats weren't fooling anyone, it would mean a complete rewrite of human civilization. Science, art, even the way we drink beer, yes, really, would be dictated by a regime that thought jazz was degenerate and modern art was a crime. Picasso, banned, Einstein, exiled, polka music, somehow, probably mandatory. And speaking of mandatory, let's talk about the fun little concept of Lebensraum, the Nazi dream of endless expansion. Eastern Europe, more like German East Vacationland. Millions displaced, cultures erased, and also some guy with a funny mustache could say, "Look how big my map is." The irony: the Nazis were so obsessed with racial purity they probably would have started purging each other next. Himmler's weird occult hobbies, yeah, that wouldn't have ended well. But here's the darkest twist: technology. The Nazis were obsessed with futuristic weapons. Rockets, jet fighters, maybe even nukes if they'd had more time. A victorious Third Reich might have pushed science forward at a terrifying pace, right before collapsing under its own insanity. Imagine a world where the moon landing happens in 1960, but the astronaut steps out and yells, "Heil Luna." Of course, we can't ignore the elephant in the room, or rather, the lack of elephants, because who knows what the Nazi-approved zoo would look like. No, in this world, history's greatest minds are either silenced or turned into propaganda machines. Shakespeare, rewritten to make Hamlet a loyal SS officer. Mozart, only if you add a chorus of Sieg Heil to the magic flute. And yet, for all their grand plans, the Nazis were hilariously incompetent at the basics. Their economy was a mess, their leadership was backstabbing on a Game of Thrones level, and let's be honest, any regime that spends more time designing fancy uniforms than feeding its people isn't built to last. So while a Nazi victory might have reshaped the world, it's just as likely they would have tripped over their own jackboots within a decade. But hey, at least we'd have really efficient trains. Now, let's talk about the daily life in a Nazi-dominated world. Picture this: you wake up to the sound of a state-approved marching band outside your window. Breakfast: probably some black bread and a side of propaganda. The radio blasts speeches about the glory of the Reich, and you're expected to nod along like it's the latest hit single. Education would be a whole new level of indoctrination. Forget about learning algebra or history, unless it's the approved version where Germany always wins. Kids would be taught that the earth is flat if the Führer said so. And gym class, more like military training for 8-year-olds. Work life wouldn't be much better. Your job would likely be assigned by the state, and if you're lucky, you'll get to build rockets or design new ways to oppress people. If you're unlucky, you'll be stuck in a factory making more leather coats for the SS. And don't even think about calling in sick, unless you want a visit from the Gestapo. Social life: forget about it. The Nazis would have their noses in everything. Your friends, your family, even your dog would be potential informants. And dating: good luck finding someone who meets the Aryan ideal. If you're not tall, blonde, and blue-eyed, you might as well join a monastery. Entertainment would be a joke, literally. The only movies allowed would be propaganda films where the hero is always a Nazi and the villain is anyone who disagrees with them. Theater: same deal. And music: forget about jazz or rock, it's all Wagner, all the time. Religion would be another casualty. The Nazis would either co-opt it or crush it. Churches would be turned into shrines for Hitler, and priests would be replaced by party officials. And if you're Jewish, Muslim, or anything else they didn't like, well, let's just say you'd be in for a rough time. But here's the kicker. Even with all this control, the Nazis would still find a way to mess it up. Their obsession with racial purity would lead to infighting, purges, and probably a civil war. And their economy, it would collapse under the weight of their endless wars and mismanagement. So, while a Nazi victory might seem like a nightmare, it's also a reminder of how fragile and ridiculous such a regime would be. They might have won the war, but they'd lose the peace, and take the world down with them. Now let's explore what science and technology would look like in this nightmare scenario. Remember those sleek Nazi rocket designs? They weren't just for show. A victorious Reich would have poured resources into their wonder weapons program, and we'd all be paying the price. The aerospace industry would be booming, but not in a good way. Those V-2 rockets that terrorized London, imagine them scaled up for intercontinental strikes. New York to Moscow in 30 minutes flat, compliments of the Third Reich's delivery service. Space exploration might have happened decades earlier, with swastika-emblazoned rockets reaching the moon by the 1950s. The first words on the lunar surface, probably something about Aryan supremacy. Medicine would take a dark turn too. Forget about ethical committees, Nazi doctors would have free rein to conduct their twisted experiments. Genetic engineering might advance rapidly, but only in service of their eugenics programs. The concept of undesirable traits could extend to anything from left-handedness to bad eyesight. Morning coffee might come with a mandatory DNA screening. Transportation presents another horrifying thought experiment. Those meticulously engineered autobahns, they'd be crawling with armored vehicles instead of family sedans. Civilian cars might be limited to party officials, with everyone else relegated to overcrowded trains running like clockwork to concentration, worker rehabilitation camps. Communications technology would be equally oppressive. Picture this. Every household required to have a government-issued radio that can't be turned off. Telephone lines monitored by cheerful operators who just happen to work for the secret police. Early versions of computers used exclusively for cataloging enemies of the state and optimizing train schedules to death camps. The entertainment industry wouldn't escape this warped technological revolution. Television broadcasts would feature non-stop propaganda, with mandatory viewing hours enforced by neighborhood wardens. Motion pictures would showcase the latest in special effects, all deployed to make Hitler look like a Greek god and his enemies look subhuman. Oddly enough, some everyday technologies might actually improve, if you're one of the chosen few. Refrigerators that keep your rations fresh. Washing machines that handle your uniform with care. But these conveniences would come at a terrible price, an entire society built on slave labor and stolen resources. The tragic irony. For all their technological ambitions, the Nazi regime was fundamentally anti-science. They rejected Jewish physics, including relativity, and purged their academic ranks of anyone with independent thoughts. This cognitive dissonance between technological aspiration and ideological dogma might have caused their system to eventually collapse under its own contradictions. And let's be real, the minute some Nazi scientist invented something actually useful, he'd probably disappear in the night after being denounced by a jealous colleague. Because in the end, no amount of technological prowess can fix a system built on paranoia, brutality, and sheer stupidity. Let's talk about sports in this twisted reality. The 1936 Olympics showed us how Nazis loved turning athletics into propaganda. In a world where they won, every sporting event would become a military parade with medals. Football matches would begin with fascist salutes instead of handshakes. The World Cup, more like the Aryan Cup, where only racially pure teams could compete. The Nazis would weaponize physical fitness. Gyms wouldn't be about health, they'd be indoctrination centers where you'd lift weights while listening to Hitler's speeches. Personal trainers would double as political officers, reporting anyone who showed weakness. Marathon running would become mandatory, with finish lines at concentration camps for those who couldn't keep up. Sports commentary would be pure propaganda. Imagine hearing, "And Muller scores for the fatherland. Just like our troops scored against the degenerate Bolsheviks." Stadiums would be designed as massive swastika shapes, because subtlety was never their strong point. Halftime shows would feature military drills instead of cheerleaders. Athletes would face impossible choices. Win and become tools of the regime. Lose and be labeled genetically inferior. Jewish players, gone. Black athletes, unthinkable. Women's sports would exist only to produce strong Aryan babies. The concept of sportsmanship would be replaced with blind obedience. Even children's games would be corrupted. Hide and seek would teach surveillance skills. Tag would become, catch the subhuman. Schoolyards would echo with fascist chants instead of laughter. PE teachers would carry whips instead of whistles. The Olympics would become the ultimate propaganda tool. Host cities would be permanently in Berlin, with events designed to showcase Nazi superiority. Judges would be SS officers. Protesting a bad call, that's a one-way ticket to a labor camp. World records would be fabricated to prove Aryan supremacy. But here's the tragic irony. Despite their obsession with physical perfection, the Nazi leadership were mostly unhealthy chain smokers with terrible diets. Hitler was a vegetarian hypochondriac, Goering was a drug-addicted glutton, and Himmler looked like an overworked accountant. Their sports utopia would have collapsed under its own hypocrisy. Let's examine the global political landscape under Nazi rule. The world map would look dramatically different, and not in a good way. Europe would essentially become one giant Germany, with puppet states mimicking the Reich's ideology. The term, world leader, would take on a terrifying new meaning. International diplomacy would be a farce. The United Nations, more like the United Aryan Nations. Every meeting would begin with a fascist salute and end with demands for more Lebensraum. Neutral countries would either be absorbed or forced into humiliating treaties. Switzerland's banks might survive, but only to launder Nazi gold. The Americas would exist in constant tension. While the Nazis might not immediately invade North America, they'd certainly try to influence it. Imagine a version of the Cold War, but with more swastikas and less subtlety. Latin America would become a battleground for Nazi-backed coups and resistance movements. Asia presents an interesting case. Japan, as an ally, would likely keep its empire, until the Nazis decided they needed more space. The phrase, Nazi-Japanese relations, would quickly become an oxymoron. Their alliance was always one of convenience, and convenience has an expiration date when fascists are involved. Africa would suffer the worst. Nazi racial theories considered black people subhuman, meaning the continent would be carved up for resources with zero regard for human life. Colonialism on steroids, with all the exploitation and none of the already minimal protections. The Sahara might become one giant labor camp. The Middle East would be particularly ironic. The Nazis hated Jews but admired Islam for its perceived warrior culture. This cognitive dissonance might lead to some bizarre alliances before inevitably collapsing when they realize people don't like being occupied, regardless of ideology. International trade would be a mess. The Nazi economic model was unsustainable even during peacetime. Now imagine it stretched across continents. Shortages would be common, quality would plummet, and the black market would become the only way to get decent coffee. The concept of, made in Germany, would inspire dread rather than quality. Travel would be a nightmare. Forget tourism. Every trip would require proving your racial purity. Passports would include detailed family trees. Border guards would carry calipers to measure skulls. The only vacation spots would be propaganda resorts where you're required to attend daily Hitler Youth meetings. Science and academia would stagnate globally. With Jewish scientists expelled or worse, and free inquiry suppressed, progress would slow to a crawl. The Nobel Prize might be replaced with the Hitler Prize for Aryan achievement. International collaboration. Forget it, unless you're collaborating on ways to oppress people. In this world, the concept of human rights wouldn't just be ignored, it would be mocked. Geneva Conventions would be rewritten in Berlin. War crimes would be standard operating procedure. The very idea of international law would be laughable to the rulers of this new order. Now let's explore what resistance might look like in this nightmare world. Even in the darkest scenarios, humans find ways to push back, though in Nazi-dominated Earth, it would come at a terrible cost. Underground movements would spring up in every occupied territory, but they'd face unprecedented challenges. Standard resistance tactics like sabotage would be met with entire villages being liquidated. The Nazi security apparatus, already terrifying in our timeline, would be exponentially worse with unlimited resources. Imagine Gestapo agents with facial recognition tech and computerized records of every citizen. The nature of resistance would vary wildly by region. In Western Europe, it might look like sophisticated spy networks funneling information to whatever free nations remain. In Eastern Europe, more like desperate guerrilla warfare in the forests. Some groups would focus on smuggling people to safety, others on assassinating key officials, each act of defiance potentially dooming hundreds to reprisals. Jewish resistance would face particularly brutal odds. With no Allied armies coming to liberate camps, underground movements inside concentration facilities might be humanity's only hope. Picture thousands of prisoners secretly organizing with smuggled weapons, waiting for their moment, knowing full well even success would likely mean death. Intellectual resistance would take subtle forms. Clandestine schools teaching real history. Artists hiding forbidden messages in state-approved works. Scientists deliberately slowing their work or sabotaging projects. Even Nazi officers quietly subverting orders, though these would be vanishingly rare. Technology would be a double-edged sword. While it gave the Nazis terrifying surveillance capabilities, it might also give rebels new tools. Secret radios broadcasting truth, crude computers cracking codes, maybe even early hacking of government systems, if anyone could access them. The psychological toll would be unimaginable. Every resistance member would live with perpetual paranoia. Is that neighbor an informant? Was that glance too long? Does the shopkeeper know? Trust would become the rarest commodity in existence. Ironically, the Nazi system's own incompetence might help resistance. Bureaucratic infighting could create gaps in surveillance. Corrupt officials might look the other way for bribes. Overstretched occupation forces could leave some areas loosely controlled. Even in totalitarianism, human failings create cracks in the system. Religious institutions would play a complex role. Some would collaborate with the regime, others would become centers of quiet resistance. Imagine secret churches hiding refugees, or monasteries preserving forbidden knowledge. The Vatican would walk an impossible tightrope between survival and moral compromise. Perhaps most heartbreaking would be family dynamics. Children turned against parents through Hitler Youth indoctrination. Spouses reporting each other for careless remarks. The most basic human bonds shattered by fear and suspicion. In such a world, love itself becomes an act of rebellion. Would resistance succeed? Probably not in any conventional sense. But in maintaining human dignity against impossible odds, in keeping alive the idea that this nightmare wasn't normal, that might be victory enough. As long as someone remembers what freedom was, hope persists, however faintly. Let's shift focus to the economy in this Nazi-dominated world. Spoiler alert, it's a disaster waiting to happen. The Nazi economic model was built on plunder, exploitation, and unsustainable policies. Now imagine that model stretched across the globe. First, the workforce. With millions enslaved or exterminated, labor shortages would be rampant. The Nazis would try to fill the gaps with forced labor, but productivity would plummet. Why work hard when your reward is more work, or worse, death? Factories would be understaffed, farms would fail, and infrastructure would crumble. Next, the currency. The Reichsmark would become the global standard, but it would be worth less than the paper it's printed on. Hyperinflation would be a constant threat as the Nazis printed money to fund their endless wars and vanity projects. Your life savings, worthless. Your paycheck, barely enough to buy a loaf of bread. Trade would be a nightmare. The Nazis' obsession with autarky, self-sufficiency, would cripple international commerce. Tariffs would be sky-high, imports would be banned, and exports would consist mainly of weapons and propaganda. Forget about globalization. This is economic isolation on steroids. Consumer goods. Forget about them. The Nazi economy prioritized military production over everything else. Need a new car? Too bad. The factories are busy building tanks. Want a radio? Sure, but it only plays state-approved broadcasts. Even basic necessities like food and clothing would be rationed, with the best stuff reserved for party loyalists. Then there's corruption. In a system where loyalty trumps competence, bribery and nepotism would be the norm. Want a job? Better know someone in the party. Need a permit? Better have something to trade. The economy would be a black market in disguise, where the only way to get ahead is to cheat the system. Innovation would stagnate. With Jewish and other, undesirable, scientists exiled or killed, research and development would grind to a halt. The Nazis' obsession with racial purity would stifle creativity, leaving the world stuck in a technological dark age. Forget about the internet. This is a world where even the telephone is a luxury. Finally, the inevitable collapse. The Nazi economy was a house of cards, built on stolen wealth and slave labor. Once the plunder ran out, the system would implode. Hyperinflation, shortages, and unrest would lead to economic meltdown. The Nazis might have won the war, but they'd lose the peace, and take the global economy down with them. Let's dive into the environmental impact of a Nazi-dominated world. Spoiler: it's not pretty. The Nazis' obsession with industrialization and conquest would leave the planet in ruins. First, deforestation. The Nazis' need for resources would lead to mass clearing of forests. Entire ecosystems would be wiped out to make way for factories, farms, and military installations. The Amazon, gone. The Congo, stripped bare. The planet's lungs would be reduced to stumps and ash. Next, pollution. With no regard for environmental regulations, factories would spew toxins into the air and water. Rivers would run black with industrial waste, and smog would choke the skies. The Nazis' love of chemical weapons would only make things worse. Imagine a world where every breath is a gamble with your health. Wildlife would suffer immensely. The Nazis' racial theories extended to animals, with some species deemed superior, and others degenerate. Predators like wolves and eagles might be protected, while lesser animals would be hunted to extinction. Zoos would become showcases of Aryan-approved fauna, with anything deemed impure eradicated. Agriculture would be a disaster. The Nazis' focus on monoculture and forced labor would deplete the soil and lead to widespread famine. Fertile lands would be overworked until they turned to dust, while genetically modified crops designed to feed the Reich would choke out native species. Food diversity. Forget about it. Your diet would consist of whatever the state decided to grow. Climate change would accelerate. The Nazis' massive industrial projects and disregard for sustainability would pump greenhouse gases into the atmosphere at an unprecedented rate. Rising sea levels, extreme weather, and desertification would become the norm. The planet would be on a fast track to ecological collapse. Even urban areas would suffer. Cities would be redesigned to reflect Nazi ideology, with sprawling concrete monstrosities replacing historic landmarks. Green spaces would be paved over for military parades, and public parks would be turned into propaganda centers. The concept of livable cities would be a distant memory. In the end, the Nazis' vision of a perfect world would leave the planet a barren, toxic wasteland. Their legacy wouldn't just be human suffering, it would be environmental devastation on a global scale. Now, let's explore the social dynamics in a world ruled by the Nazis. Spoiler: it's a dystopian nightmare where fear and paranoia reign supreme. First, the concept of family. The Nazis' obsession with racial purity would infiltrate every household. Marriages would be state-controlled, with couples required to prove their Aryan lineage before being allowed to wed. Children would be taken from undesirable parents and raised in state-run institutions. Family bonds, replaced by loyalty to the Reich. Next, education. Schools would be indoctrination centers, where children are taught to worship Hitler and despise anyone deemed inferior. History lessons would glorify Nazi victories, while science classes would focus on eugenics and racial theory. Critical thinking, extinguished. Creativity, crushed. The goal, to produce obedient, unquestioning citizens. Social hierarchies would be rigid and unforgiving. At the top, the party elite, living in luxury while everyone else struggles. Below them, the worthy Aryans, who enjoy limited privileges in exchange for their loyalty. At the bottom, everyone else, Jews, Slavs, Roma, LGBTQ+ individuals, and anyone else the Nazis deemed subhuman. Social mobility, non-existent. Community life would be a facade. Neighbors would spy on each other, reporting any signs of dissent to the authorities. Trust would be a rare commodity, as even the slightest suspicion could lead to arrest, or worse. Public gatherings would be tightly controlled, with any unauthorized meetings crushed immediately. Religion would be twisted to serve the regime. Churches would be co-opted or destroyed, replaced by state-approved institutions that preach Nazi ideology. Religious leaders who resisted would be silenced, while those who collaborated would be rewarded. Faith, reduced to a tool of control. Even leisure activities would be corrupted. Sports, music, and art would all be used to promote Nazi ideals. Hobbies that didn't align with the regime's goals would be banned. Personal expression, suppressed. The goal, to ensure every aspect of life reinforces loyalty to the Reich. Mental health would suffer immensely. Living in constant fear, with no outlet for individuality or dissent, would take a toll on the population. Depression, anxiety, and suicide rates would skyrocket. The Nazis, of course, would dismiss these issues as signs of weakness, rather than addressing the root causes. In the end, society under Nazi rule would be a hollow shell of what it once was. Fear would replace love, obedience would replace freedom, and conformity would replace individuality. It's a world where the human spirit is crushed under the weight of tyranny. Let's examine the long-term consequences of Nazi global domination. Decades after their victory, the world would be unrecognizable, a grotesque parody of human civilization slowly rotting from within. The Nazi system contained the seeds of its own destruction. Their obsession with racial purity would have led to severe inbreeding among the elite. Imagine a ruling class of genetically unstable fanatics, their bloodlines weakened by generations of selective breeding. The master race would be anything but. Language itself would mutate under Nazi rule. German would dominate globally, but stripped of foreign loanwords and creativity. A sterile, bureaucratic tongue good only for giving orders and reporting dissent. Regional dialects would be purged as impure. The Tower of Babel rebuilt as a prison. Art and culture would enter a dark age. Withal, degenerate, art destroyed and innovation punished, creative expression would stagnate. Future archaeologists would find endless copies of the same heroic statues and patriotic novels. The 20th century's cultural flowering replaced by endless winter. Science would face similar decay. Without Jewish researchers and international collaboration, progress would slow to a crawl. Nazi-approved science would be a mix of outdated theories and racial pseudoscience. Imagine a world where medicine never advanced beyond 1940s levels because the best researchers were murdered. The environment would be devastated. Industrial pollution unchecked by regulations. Forests cleared for military projects. Nuclear tests conducted with no concern for fallout. The Nazis might have won the war only to inherit a poisoned, dying planet. Human psychology would change fundamentally. Generations raised in constant fear would develop collective trauma. Basic social trust, the foundation of civilization, would erode. Even if the regime fell, its psychological scars might never heal. A world where everyone is both prisoner and guard. Ironically, the Nazi empire might collapse from sheer incompetence. Their system rewarded loyalty over ability, leading to catastrophic mismanagement. Picture a global superpower that can't keep the lights on because all the competent engineers were purged. The ultimate fate of every totalitarian regime, eaten by its own stupidity. In the end, a Nazi victory would have been a dead end for humanity. Not just morally repugnant, but practically unsustainable. Their dream of a 1,000-year Reich might have lasted a few decades at most before collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. The frightening part, they nearly won. Thanks for joining this disturbing journey through a world that might have been. If you want more dark, what if scenarios, leave a comment below with your ideas. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more unsettling alternative history content. Remember, studying these nightmares helps ensure they stay in the realm of fiction. Keep questioning, keep learning, and most importantly, never forget.